The prairie was silent, save for the whisper of wind threading through tall grass. Under the pale shimmer of a pre-dawn moon, 200 Comanche warriors formed a wide circle around a worn-out ranch, their horses still, their weapons ready. Faces painted for war, eyes sharp and unwavering, yet not a word was spoken. At the center of that circle stood one man, unarmed, barefoot in the dirt, silhouetted against the faint light spilling from a cabin window. Bear Mallister, a rancher, once just a name lost to the dust of the frontier, now facing something far greater than rustlers or drought. Behind him, inside that modest wooden shelter, a child slept, small, fragile, and not his own. A girl with skin of a different shade, her world carved from a culture often viewed as enemy. But Bear had made a choice not out of duty or strategy but instinct, kindness. No one knew yet what the warriors had come for. Vengeance, justice, or something too old and raw to name, but Bear knew this: some acts of mercy don't go unnoticed, and when they do, they can summon not applause but an army. It began with a shimmer in the heat, a shape too small to be a threat, staggering near the creek just past the fence line. Bear Mallister wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted. At first, he thought it was a mirage. But the figure kept moving, zigzagging through the dust like a leaf caught in the wind. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, wrapped in tattered cloth that once held meaning, beads and patterns faded by time and sun. Her steps were slow, her body gaunt, her eyes hollow. Even from a distance, Bear felt something not in his chest. Hunger like that has a way of erasing all borders. In Texas back then, a child like her would have been seen as a threat before a soul. Settlers and Comanche were locked in a cycle of suspicion, raids, and unspoken fear. Most ranchers would have raised a rifle, or at best turned their back. Bear did neither. He dropped the hammer and nails he'd been using to fix the fence. No sudden moves. He raised his hands, made his presence known, and walked slowly toward her. She didn't run. She couldn't. Her lips cracked, her legs trembling. She motioned with tiny hands from her mouth to the creek. She was starving, and thirsty, and far from wherever she belonged. Bear knelt not to speak but to see her eyes more clearly. What he found there wasn't just desperation. It was the kind of fear that only comes when you've been lost too long to remember what safety feels like. He thought of the stories he'd heard, of Comanche raids, of missing children, of revenge. But mostly he thought of what it would mean to turn away. He scooped her up in his arms. She was light, like a bundle of reeds, and without a word he carried her back across the field, past the leaning fence, into the only shelter he knew. Inside the cabin, he laid her gently on the worn chair beside the fireplace. She didn't resist. He moved fast, warming up yesterday's stew, cutting thick slices of fresh bread. As the smell filled the room, her breathing grew steadier. Her eyes, though still wary, began to focus. This was no grand act, no heroic mission, just one man doing what felt right in a place where right and wrong had long been twisted by fear. But in the moment Bear chose to feed. The stew was almost gone when Bear noticed it, just a glint at first, peeking out from under the child's torn collar. He leaned in to offer her another spoonful, and that's when the light hit it just right. beads woven in intricate patterns, colors still vibrant despite the dust and wear. His breath caught. He had seen those before, not on a map, not in a book, but in a conversation by the general store just a week back. Old Pete Morrison had described them, hands trembling slightly as he spoke of the ceremonial beads worn only by the family of White Bull, the Comanche war chief whose name alone quieted barrooms. Bear sat back slowly, his hand still hovering in the air with the spoon. The girl, unaware, reached for it, desperate for another bite. And as she ate, his thoughts raced, not with fear at first, but calculation. If she was who he now suspected, this wasn't just a child lost in the wilderness. She was the daughter of a man who could rally warriors from 4 directions and bring fire to half the territory. To shelter her, even unknowingly, could be seen as a challenge, an act of defiance, or worse, a threat. Bear's eyes moved from the necklace to the girl's face. She was still chewing, slower now, her body no longer trembling quite so much. But her eyes, they held that same wild alertness. She may have been a child, but she knew danger, and she had likely seen it up close. His stomach turned with the realization. Saving her wasn't just an act of kindness anymore. It was a crossing, one that might cost him everything. Still, he didn't take the beads from her, didn't question her. He simply reached for the bread, broke off another piece, and placed it gently in her hand. Outside, the land was still quiet. But something had already shifted. Bear felt it deep in his bones. This wasn't just about food or mercy or doing what was right. This was about stepping into a storm he couldn't. The knock came like a crack of thunder against a quiet morning. Bear opened the door to find 3 men, Cletus Hartwell, Deputy Morrison, and Reverend Thomas, riding hard toward the cabin, dust still clinging to their boots. Their faces weren't just tight with anger, they carried something heavier. Fear. "Bear," Cletus shouted before dismounting, "what in God's name are you doing?" The girl inside didn't stir. She was asleep in Bear's chair, wrapped in his only blanket, a half-eaten piece of bread still clutched in her hand. Bear stepped outside, pulling the door gently shut behind him. He didn't want them waking her, not yet. The deputy didn't mince words. "You know she's missing, right? The whole town's talking. They say Chief White Bull's daughter wandered off 3 days ago." He paused, measuring Bear's reaction. "Smoke signals went up last night. They're looking for her. And your trail leads straight to here." Bear's throat tightened. He didn't deny it, he didn't lie, he didn't try to explain why. "She was starving," he said, voice low. "I couldn't let her die." The silence that followed was sharper than any accusation. Reverend Thomas was the first to break it. "You have no idea what you've done." And Bear, he did. He felt it in the weight of every footstep, in the stillness of the air. This wasn't just about helping a child anymore. It was about choosing sides in a war that hadn't begun yet, but would if he made the wrong move. Cletus was pacing now, hat crushed in his hands. "They're gonna think you took her." "Hell, they probably already do." Deputy Morrison swung back on his horse. "I'm giving you a head start. Get her back, tonight, before they find you." Then he was gone, dust trailing behind him like smoke from a fuse. Bear stood in that silence, the Reverend and Cletus staring at him like a man already buried. Behind the door, the child breathed softly, and in that moment, Bear faced the truth. Sometimes doing what's right doesn't make you feel brave. It just makes you feel. It started just past midnight. A low, distant thump, like thunder rolling through bone-dry ground. Bear sat by the fire, barely dozing when he heard it. At first he thought it might be wind or the creak of wood settling. But the rhythm was too steady, too alive. War drums. He moved to the window. The prairie was still cloaked in night, but the sound was growing louder, closer, slow, deliberate beats like a heart preparing for something final. He didn't need to see them to know they were coming. Behind him, the girl stirred. The drums must have woken her too. She sat upright, eyes wide, scanning the cabin with a clarity Bear hadn't seen before. Then she pointed to the door, then to herself, then made a motion with her hands, opening and closing her fingers one by one. Bear watched. 10, 20, 30. She didn't stop. By the time she reached 200, Bear felt his knees weaken. He'd hoped perhaps for a few riders, a scouting party, something he could explain his way out of. But this was an army. The drumming ceased suddenly, swallowed by silence so sharp it rang in his ears. Somehow that was worse. The absence of sound held more threat than the noise ever had. Bear looked at the child, so small, yet somehow more aware of what was coming than he was. She grabbed his sleeve, eyes pleading, hands gesturing wildly. She wasn't afraid for herself. The cabin door groaned as it opened, and Bear stepped into the moonlight like a man crossing into judgment. His hands were raised high, fingers spread, palms open. No weapon, no threat. Just flesh, breath, and the unbearable weight of what might come next. Behind him, barefoot on the wooden floor, the child followed. She said nothing, but her presence was loud in the stillness. 200 Comanche warriors watched their every move, unmoving, their arrows drawn but not yet released. The silence was so deep it seemed to hum. Then one rider stepped forward. He didn't need to introduce himself. Bear knew. Everyone knew. Chief White Bull. His posture, the silver streaks in his braided hair, the scars etched across his chest like a map of battles survived, all of it declared power. His eyes didn't blink. They burned. "You have taken something that belongs to us," he said. "Send her out. Perhaps then you will live to see morning." Bear's mouth was dry. He could barely form the words. "She came to my land," he managed. "Starving." White Bull didn't flinch. "And you knew who she was?" Bear nodded slowly. "Not at first, but yes, I knew." A pause. Then came the question unspoken. What proof? What defense could a white man offer that wouldn't sound like an excuse? Bear reached into his coat pocket. Slowly, deliberately, every bowstring in the circle tightened. Every warrior leaned forward. But he didn't pull a weapon, just a small torn scrap of fabric, weathered and clinging to a thorn. "She wore this when I found her. It caught on my fence." He held it out. White Bull approached with the slow grace of a mountain lion, took the fabric, turned it in his fingers. His eyes flickered. Recognition. But the weight of doubt wasn't lifted. Not yet. Then the girl moved. She stepped between Bear and her father, lifted a hand to touch White Bull's arm. She said something fast and urgent in Comanche, pointing to Bear, then to the cabin, then to her own belly. Her voice was soft but clear. And when she finished, she smiled, small, tentative, the kind only a child who hasn't had reason to smile in days can give. That smile, in all its quiet truth, cracked something open. Not in the circle of warriors, not in the chief, but in the moment itself. And inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Its glow washed over the modest space. One chair, one table, a blanket folded with care. And on that table, resting among a few wildflowers dried to parchment, was a small photograph. Worn at the edges, faded in the center. A woman with kind eyes, a boy with a mischievous grin, and Bear, younger, holding them both. White Bull stepped in behind his daughter, his eyes scanning the room, landing on that single frame. He moved toward it without a word, lifting it gently as if it might fall apart under his fingers. For a long time he just stared. "She was your blood?" he asked without looking up. Bear nodded. "My boy lost him to cholera 3 years ago." White Bull didn't reply, but something shifted in the room, a stillness that wasn't silence but shared memory. The kind only those who have buried a child carry in their bones. "My daughter," the chief said at last, still watching the photo. "She was all I had left from her mother." He didn't speak of war or justice. He didn't remind Bear that 200 warriors waited outside. In that moment they weren't enemies, just two fathers, both standing in places where children used to laugh. The child, sensing the air change, moved toward the table and touched the edge of the photograph. Then she looked at White Bull, then Bear, then back again. Her hands formed no words, but her meaning was clear. Both men had known loss. Both had chosen to protect what little remained. White Bull set the picture down, careful, almost reverent. And for the first time since the drums began to beat, no one felt the need to speak. The door had barely closed behind White Bull when a voice split the silence like lightning on dry prairie. It came from the edge of the warrior circle, sharp, angry, too young to carry the weight it demanded, but loud enough to turn every head. A man stepped forward, his war paint still fresh, his spear glinting under moonlight. Broken Arrow. He didn't ask permission, didn't lower his voice. His words flew in rapid Comanche, cutting through the night like blades. And though Bear didn't understand the language, he understood the fury, the judgment, the threat. White Bull listened in stillness, jaw clenched, arms crossed over his chest. But the ripple had begun. Several warriors behind Broken Arrow shifted forward, not in aggression, but in alignment. A line was being drawn. Broken Arrow pointed to Bear, then to the girl, then struck the butt of his spear against the ground once, twice. The message was clear, no translation needed. Mercy was weakness, and weakness invited ruin. Bear didn't move. He couldn't. He was unarmed, outnumbered, and surrounded not by outlaws or raiders, but by men who believed they were owed blood. The girl stepped closer to him, her small frame trembling. But it wasn't fear for herself. It was the tension between her father and this young warrior that made her cling to Bear's side. She felt the pull, ancestral, political, personal, all of it crashing together in the dirt between them. White Bull responded, voice low but sharp like gravel underfoot. His authority hadn't left him, but it was being tested. Even Bear could see it. This wasn't just about a child anymore. It was about a generation's memory of betrayal and whether mercy could stand against it. And so Bear stood still, his very presence a question hanging in the air. Would compassion be seen as courage or treason? For a long breath, the prairie held its answer. The door had barely closed behind White Bull when a voice split the silence like lightning on dry prairie. It came from the edge of the warrior circle, sharp, angry, too young to carry the weight it demanded, but loud enough to turn every head. A man stepped forward, his war paint still fresh, his spear glinting under moonlight. Broken Arrow. He didn't ask permission, didn't lower his voice. His words flew in rapid Comanche, cutting through the night like blades. And though Bear didn't understand the language, he understood the fury, the judgment, the threat. White Bull listened in stillness, jaw clenched, arms crossed over his chest. But the ripple had begun. Several warriors behind Broken Arrow shifted forward, not in aggression but in alignment. A line was being drawn. Broken Arrow pointed to Bear, then to the girl, then struck the butt of his spear against the ground once, twice. The message was clear, no translation needed. Mercy was weakness, and weakness invited ruin. Bear didn't move. He couldn't. He was unarmed, outnumbered, and surrounded not by outlaws or raiders, but by men who believed they were owed blood. The girl stepped closer to him, her small frame trembling. But it wasn't fear for herself. It was the tension between her father and this young warrior that made her cling to Bear's side. She felt the pull, ancestral, political, personal, all of it crashing together in the dirt between them. White Bull responded, voice low but sharp like gravel underfoot. His authority hadn't left him, but it was being tested. Even Bear could see it. This wasn't just about a child anymore. It was about a generation's memory of betrayal and whether mercy could stand against it. And so Bear stood still, his very presence a question hanging in the air. Would compassion be seen as courage or treason? For a long breath, the prairie held its answer. They rode in silence, Bear on horseback, flanked by warriors whose eyes never left him. The prairie gave way to canyons, then to a narrow path few settlers had ever seen. This was no casual visit. This was a summons to a place no white man had entered and returned from whole. If they meant to end it here, they wouldn't need permission. But Bear wasn't being led to an execution. Not yet. He was being led to something far older, far more exacting, judgment. When they arrived, the village was waiting. Fires crackled low in a tight circle, shadows dancing across the weathered faces of 7 elders. Men whose lives had been shaped by broken treaties, lost sons, and the long wait of survival. Bear stood in the center, alone. White Bull spoke first, explaining in their tongue what had happened. His daughter's disappearance, the night at the cabin, the tension that nearly became war. Then Broken Arrow stood, his voice harder, sharper. He spoke of tradition, of vengeance, of history soaked in betrayal. Not in anger, but in pain. The elders listened, unmoved. And then the girl stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. She spoke slowly, deliberately. No tears, just memory, what she had endured, what Bear had done, what he hadn't done. When she finished, the oldest among them, a man with snow-white hair and a gaze that had likely seen too much, asked her a single question. White Bull translated it aloud. "If you were lost again," the elder asked, "if it all happened the same way, do you believe he would save you again, knowing what it might cost him?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word echoed through the clearing, as final and solid as stone. The elders leaned together in quiet conversation, voices hushed but firm. Bear's heart pounded with every beat of their deliberation. He had no idea what answer he'd earned, or if mercy would weigh more than memory. Then the white-haired elder rose, his joints stiff, his stance solemn. "The spirits tested us tonight," White Bull translated. "Not in battle, but in truth. And sometimes mercy deserves mercy in return." Bear didn't breathe until he saw the nods. Small, slow, but enough. He would be allowed to return, alive, not just spared but protected. A promise made not just to him, but to the idea that kindness could still mean something. But only because a dawn broke not with fire but with calm. The drums were gone, replaced by birdsong. And when Bear rode back across the prairie, it was not alone. He had no chains around his wrists, no blade at his back. Instead, he had an escort, an honor guard of Comanche riders who kept their distance but not their distrust. Still, they rode in peace. Back at the ranch, the cabin stood as he'd left it, modest, weather-worn, but unchanged. The same couldn't be said for Bear. Something inside him had shifted, and it showed in the way he dismounted, the way he looked toward the horizon, not just as land but as possibility. Word spread faster than wildfire. Not of his survival, but of what had passed. That Bear Mallister had harbored the daughter of White Bull and lived. That the tribe had spared him. That he'd faced judgment and left with more than his life. He left with trust. His ranch, once a lonely patch of fence and dust, became something new. A meeting place. A neutral ground. Comanche riders came not with arrows but with messages. Settlers arrived wary but left with stories of trade, of conversation, even shared meals. And the girl, she returned year after year, not as a child in need but as a young woman with quiet authority. She walked the land as someone who knew it from both sides, a translator, a bridge, the living echo of one man's moment of mercy. Bear never grew rich. He never sought fame. But in time, his cabin walls held the laughter of guests from both tribes and towns. And each season, when the prairie grasses turned gold, he'd set a place at the table, for her, for memory, for the idea that kindness might not change the world in thunderclaps, but it could plant something